Thank you. Thanks very much. That was my dad that started that. Nice one, Dad. Yeah, my husband and I were just having a little bit of a giggle about whether you'd see me over the top of the lectern and not to forget to move the microphone down. Yeah, Brian and I are a bit like the little and large of the Noonan Syndrome world, I think. So, the first thing I need to talk to you about is Martin's advice to me. He said that I have to tell you right off the bat that I am a very, very emotional person. In fact, I think I'm probably a little bit hyper-emotional, with every emotion, not just, the tearful kind. So if I do this during the talk, pay no attention to it at all, because my floods of tears is you're slightly moved, all right? So what I'm going to talk about is sort of 3 key times in my life as I found out about Noonan Syndrome and lived with Noonan Syndrome. And the first would be diagnosis and the period there. And then my life with Martin, my husband, and the choices we made. And then the hunt for the gene. So first of all is diagnosis. I was born with pulmonary valve stenosis, and that was identified very, very quickly. But other than that, didn't seem to be any other issues, other than I had the most impressive projectile vomit. And I also was, once that my mum tried to wean me, I wasn't very keen. And I was very, very picky eater, and I'd say that lasted right up into my 20s. And I think it sort of, that eased as I gained control over cooking and knew that I had to actually improve my diet if I wanted to be healthy. And now I'll eat everything, with the exception of sprouts, and I have tried. And I continue to try, but they do make me want to vomit, so... Now, with my heart condition, I wasn't diagnosed until much later, but I had my first open heart surgery at the age of 4.5, so in the year I started school. And obviously, my parents and I have had a number of conversations about this period of my life, and this is what I take from what we got up to at that time. So this is my mum. She doesn't look like that, but that was what my mum did. She didn't sleep, as far as I understood. Very stressed and didn't sleep. And this is my dad. I don't think he actually did faint, but he did feel faint and had to have the support of a table, but I thought that was a funnier slide. And this is what happened to me. I had a great time in hospital. And the nurses were fantastic. There were parties. I don't really remember negative things. And the point of this is to say that I 100% believe, I'm going to get choked. It's okay. 100% believe that it's worse for the families than it is for the person going through it. Sorry. It's just slightly moved. Just remember that. It really is. It's harder for you. So then we move on to diagnosis. Sorry, I might just have to take a breath. I was diagnosed when I was 16 at a routine cardiology appointment. And it was really fine. I look upset, but it actually was a brilliant move. The cardiology appointment was very smooth, nothing to report. Everything was going very well. And I thought it was over. And right at the end of the appointment, the doctor said, "Is there anything else you want to discuss?" And I was like, "No, I'm out of here," right? But my mum said, "Yeah, Andrea's very concerned about height." Well, it didn't go down very well. I was not happy. It was a very sensitive subject for me. I was deeply unhappy about being so tiny. And I am only 4'9", and it was my aim in life to get to 5 foot at the very least. And by the time I was 16, I was starting to realise this is not going to happen. So when my mum mentioned it, I really could have, there were violent thoughts, but I didn't act on them. But if she had never said it, there possibly would never have been a diagnosis. Well, certainly not at an early stage. So thanks, Mum. But it came at a time before the internet, and we are talking chalkboard time. It was in the 80s, sort of mid-80s, and research was hard work. It was very hard to find out any information, and I wasn't aware of any kind of groups. I know that Brian had access to Noonan Syndrome newsletters, didn't you, Brian? But we didn't get anything like that, and I didn't know very much, but I was lucky that my mum worked at the time at Leeds General Infirmary, and she was able to get articles from the hospital. And she chose very carefully the articles that she brought home for me to read, because she said she didn't want, later I found out, she didn't want me to be overloaded or upset by any of the information that I could find out. So it started a very, very sort of deep interest in Noonan Syndrome, and if any of you have Noonan Syndrome can identify with this, I have a very obsessive personality. If I become interested in something, I'm not just a little bit interested in it, I'm deeply interested in it. So it kind of really took over my life quite significantly. I wanted to know as much about it as I possibly could, and I became obsessed with knowing where Noonan Syndrome ended and where Andrea began. I don't know why it was so important for me to know that, but it was. And it's something that I ruminate on a lot. Now, apart from the obvious pulmonary valve stenosis and my short stature and my low set ears that are posteriorly rotated and all that sort of thing, my learning profile seemed to fit Noonan Syndrome quite heavily, but then so does my dad's. He doesn't look as if he's got Noonan Syndrome, we're not sure. My reading, it took me a long time to learn to read, and it took me even longer to learn to like to read. It took me even longer to actually read, just because I could. Spelling was not very good. Handwriting was really rubbish. It wasn't very clear. It was very hard work, and it was actually, and it still is, painful. It hurts my hands to write. It hurts my arms. So it's not an easy thing to do. I do have some tips, so come to me later. My maths was... I'd say all of that was, right? But also it's a great word to use because as an acronym, it stands for constant repetition and perseverance. And all of those things have improved with that. In fact, my mum, if you ask my mum now, she would tell you she thinks my handwriting's beautiful. But only with certain pens. I am hyper-emotional. I don't know whether that is common. I feel like it might be, or at least issues with emotions are. If I watch anything that has any kind of emotional nuance, I will cry. If you are sad, I will feel like it's my pain. I find it very hard to separate my emotion from your emotion. So if you pair that with getting a diagnosis as a 16-year-old, getting a diagnosis anyway of something that could be a problem, has been a problem, getting a diagnosis as a teenager, getting a diagnosis as a teenager who is very dramatic, then all I can really say about that is hats off to mum and dad for dealing with that. And like Brian said, he came to things very late, he grew into his IQ, and his IQ will continue to grow, I'm sure. I am very much like that, but I'm also a geek. I'm quirky and become very interested in things. That has been a benefit to me because I'm tenacious with something that I'm interested in. Noonan Syndrome went back into its box during my A-levels and my university degree, largely because it was harder for me to find out information. It wasn't easy, but also because I was pretty tired. I had a lot to do, so I was studying. I found it very hard, though, to get the results I wanted. I was desperate to be a teacher, so I worked very hard. I scraped through GCSEs enough to get into my A-levels. I scraped through my A-levels enough to get into a university. But I started studying for my teaching degree, and I got a very, very good degree qualification. And then a few years later, I did a master's degree in autism and education and got a distinction in that. But I have to say, autism, before I knew that it's highly linked with Noonan Syndrome, is an absolute passion of mine. So it became my world, and that's why I did so well. Oh, I've got to go back. Life with Martin. Martin and I had been friends, good friends, for about 10 years before we started going out with each other. And so very quickly became very serious about each other. I can't look at you. And within about 2 or 3 weeks, I knew that I had to have a very big conversation with him, because he needed to consider Noonan Syndrome, and he'd always known about it, but when you know about it with somebody that's a friend, and it doesn't impact on your life, you don't really know about it, do you? So I said to him, you need to think about Noonan Syndrome. Oh, it's fine. And I said, no, you need to think about it, because you need to think about whether you want to have children. And you need to think about whether you want to have children with me, because 50-50 chance any child I have will have Noonan Syndrome. And memory is a very, very funny thing, especially when you've got rose-tinted glasses on and you're in love. Because my memory, he'll correct me afterwards, is that he said to me, well, if they're anything like you, they'll be gorgeous. Oh. It's very naive. And I said to him, Martin, that's very naive. So you need to find out about it. Now, he is an IT fella, and we got to the 1990s, so along came the internet, and it was a lot easier. So we did do a lot of research and a lot of thinking and talking, probably over a period of about a month. And yes, he did decide it was all right. It was whatever turn life took, we would deal with it together. And we did get married and bought a house and a lovely garden. And we went on to have Francesca, our eldest child, who is now 11. And we were very supported by the cardiology department at Birmingham and the obstetrics department. It's a joint clinic. It was fantastic. And the geneticist, my geneticist, Dr. Cox, had a look at Francesca's when she was born. Because my gene that causes Noonan syndrome isn't identified, can only diagnose clinically, and it appeared as though Francesca doesn't have Noonan syndrome. Then I had to have 3 days after Francesca was 2, I had open heart surgery again to correct the leak to my pulmonary valve. So I had a big stretch on my right atrium because 30% of the blood that was pumped out of my heart leaked back into it. And it was a hard time if you thought about it, if you stopped and thought about it, it was a very hard time. I was worried that I could leave my daughter motherless, and that it's hard to say, isn't it? And that I could leave my husband widowed and a single father. But I knew that if I spent time worrying about that, then I would spoil the times leading up to it, and that's not worth it, is it? So we had a very happy time, and it was great, and I made a fantastic recovery. And then I went on to have Claudia, who is now 8 yesterday. So it's great because she gets to do all the activities like a crazy thing. So they were both seen clinically, and clinically they don't look as if they have Noonan syndrome. But 2 things happened last year. I was very lucky that an old friend of mine, Maggie, got in touch with me because her granddaughter was diagnosed with having Noonan syndrome. So that was lucky. And then Maggie said, you're going to the Families Day? And I was like, Families Day? What Families Day? Noonan Syndrome Association? What Noonan Syndrome Association? How can you go through 30 years of life not knowing about it? But I didn't. So came along to the Families Day, and 2 things I heard that made me think, right, we need to find out about the gene. The Geneda Project. We talked about the Geneda Project at last year's day, and so if you don't know about the Geneda Project, that is a database that aims to collate information about people with particular genetic variations, mutations, right? To find out if there are any commonalities between them in terms of their health and their progress, whatever, and that would help identify areas for research. What a fantastic thing. So I thought, right, well, I can't enter my details onto that because I don't know my genes, so I have to do it. And then the second thing was that it's possible to have Noonan syndrome and not look as if you have. So it's possible to have Noonan syndrome and not be diagnosed clinically. Well, that doesn't rule out Noonan syndrome for my daughters then, does it? So I need to know what the gene is so that I can know whether they need access to support and that I can point them in the right direction for taking things into their own hands and having power themselves. Here they are. We love a cream tea. So there we are, the gene variant, that we're now on the hunt for that. I went back to my geneticist and she did a full panel. None of the identified genes are my cause of Noonan syndrome. So I've entered the 100,000 Genomes Project. Dr. Cox has once again looked at Francesca and Claudia. I am a bit concerned for Francesca because although she doesn't have any heart condition, she's actually taller than me. Her learning profile is very similar to mine, and the projectile vomit, I used to have to change my entire clothing. She would feed, vomit, feed again, right? And she would feed for 40 minutes was a good short time, but well into an hour, then vomit and start all over again, right? So there's all those things, and she has poor muscle tone, I'm convinced of it. She finds it very hard to open things. There are things, but is that Noonan syndrome? Or is that just a coincidence that I have that and it's nothing to do with Noonan syndrome and she's got that from me? Who knows? Okay? Geneticists have a look at her again, thinks the likelihood is she doesn't have Noonan syndrome, but we won't know for sure, will we? Until we get this gene sorted. So, once again, Noonan syndrome's back out of its box, it's filling my mind, and we're thinking about it ever such a lot. But what I realise is it's okay to pick it up and let it fill your mind. It's okay to put it down again. Because, as was said earlier on, knowledge is power. I have to understand it to be able to help myself. But I have to be able to put it away in order to be able to relax and have a nice life. Okay? It doesn't have to be there every moment of the day, but I have to know it. Now, I do have a bit of a dark sense of humour, and one of the things that I find funny that I would have upset me when I was younger, a few of these things I'm just going to say. Like, I used to get quite upset about my webbing. It's not massively significant, but it's there. Now I think, well, it just makes me look like I work out, doesn't it? But without all that effort that she has to go to. Also, a few years ago, I was reading about short stature, and I found out that if you are under 4'11" with a genetic cause, for a medical reason, because everybody's short for a genetic cause, aren't they? But anyway, for a medical reason, then the medical term for that is dwarfism. Now, if you'd have told me that at 16, Andrew, you're a dwarf, I would have been quite upset, I'm sure. However, I'm a geek and I love sci-fi and science fiction, and we're all over the place. Right? And that also means that I get to be in the same gang as this fella, and who wouldn't want to be in his gang? right? Although I'm not sure I'm small enough to be in the little people's group. Martin's always telling me if I went along, they'd kick me out. Also, the gene variant, right? That's a mutation. I'm a mutant. Right? And you know what my superpower is? I'm an empath. Yeah? I identify with people. I empathise with them. I have a drive to help. I have a need to help them. And in the job that I do, I'm a special needs teacher. How brilliant is that? So, these things are great. Yes, there are difficulties in my life because I have Noonan Syndrome. But there are things about me, who I am, whether they're to do with Noonan Syndrome or not, that ameliorate those things. My persistence, my single-mindedness, my bloody pig-headed bloody mindedness, that's what it is. And my obsessive interests, they help. And because of those things, I do have my maths GCSE. It took me 5 times, but I have it. Right? Okay? Now we'll move on to the 100,000 genomes. What happens if, with the results from the project come back and it says, we still don't know the gene? Well, that'll be frustrating, but we just have to move forward from there. What if it says, Andrew, you know you don't have Noonan Syndrome at all? Well, that'll be really gutting. I'll have to go join another association. And it could be the association of one. So if anybody watches The Big Bang Theory, you know what I'm talking about. Hello, Sheldon Cooper, I'm with him. Right. But if it shows the gene, if the gene's known, then we can check my daughters. We can check my dad. I have a bit of suspicion there. And we can find out, we can rule it in or we can rule it out, and we can give them the power. This is the last slide. What will I say to my daughters if I have Noonan Syndrome? And I realise that it's the same 3 things that I will say to them if they have Noonan Syndrome as if they don't. And the first is, if there's something big in your life, like Noonan Syndrome, that fills it, it's okay to let it fill your world for a while. Arm yourself. But put it down and relax. The second thing is, work to your strengths. And the third thing is, embrace your foibles, because those are the things that the right people will love you for. And what I know for myself is, I'm not Noonan Syndrome. Noonan Syndrome isn't me, but I wouldn't be me without it, and that's okay. So.